Hi everybody. We're going to be reading a chapter book together, and this chapter book is by two-time Newbery Award winner Lois Lowry. She's one of my favorite authors, and I think you're really going to enjoy this story. I'm going to read one chapter of the story each time we meet. Now, it would be great if you could have a notebook handy to write down answers to questions that I ask. I will also post the questions on my website. Now, let's look at the summary. Here's the front of the book, called Goony Bird Green by Lois Lowry, and the illustrations are by Mitty Thomas. Now I want to take a look at the summary on the back of the book. Oftentimes chapter books have summaries on the back to let you know what the story's about. Here's the back of the book. Summaries include the main character, and some of the main events or parts of the story. When you write a summary, you always write it in your own words. You should never copy the story. Now, the summary says, there's never been anyone like Goony Bird Green at Water Tower Elementary School. What other new kid would come to school wearing pajamas and cowboy boots one day and a polka dot t-shirt and a tutu on another? Goony Bird has to sit right smack in the center of class because she likes to be in the middle of everything. She's the star of story time and keeps everyone on the edge of their seats with her absolutely true stories. But what about her classmates? Do they have stories good enough to share? Wow, that sounds like it's going to be a great story. Remember, the characters in the story are the people or the animals in the story. The main character is who the story is mostly about. Who do you think is going to be the main character in this story? The summary talks a lot about Goony Bird Green, and her name is also the title of the book. I think she might be the main character. So let's begin with chapter 1. Now, as I'm reading, I'm going to stop to model some skills for you or to ask you questions. If you need to stop the tape, just press stop on the player, and then you can press play when you're ready to continue. So here's the little picture at the top of chapter 1. Now, some chapter books have titles for each chapter. This book does not. There was a new student in the Water Tower Elementary School. She arrived in October, after the first month of school had already passed. She opened the second grade classroom door at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and appeared there all alone, without even a mother to introduce her. She was wearing pajamas and cowboy boots and was holding a dictionary and a lunchbox. "Hello, Mrs. Pigeon," the second grade teacher said. "We're in the middle of our spelling lesson." "Good," said the girl in pajamas. "I brought my dictionary. Where's my desk?" "Who are you?" Miss Pigeon asked politely. "I'm your new student. My name is Goony Bird Green." That's green with a silent E at the end. "And I just moved here from China. I want a desk right smack in the middle of the room because I like to be right smack in the middle of everything." Now, I remember when my family moved to a new house and I had to go to a new school. I felt scared and nervous because I didn't know anyone and I didn't have any friends there. I bet that's how Goony Bird is feeling on her first day. Now, I just made a connection from the story to my own life. How do you think Goony Bird is feeling? Have you ever felt the way she's feeling? Have you ever experienced being the new kid somewhere? The class stared at the new girl with admiration. They'd never met anyone like Goony Bird Green. And here's what she looked like. She was a good student. She sat down at the desk Mrs. Pigeon provided, right smack in the middle of everything, and she began doing second grade spelling. She did all of her work neatly and quickly, and she followed instructions. But soon it was clear that Goony Bird was mysterious and interesting. Her clothes were unusual. Her hairstyles were unusual. Even her lunches were very unusual. At lunchtime on Wednesday, her first day in the school, she opened her lunchbox and brought out sushi and a pair of bright green chopsticks. On Thursday, her second day at Water Tower Elementary School, Goony Bird Green was wearing a pink ballet tutu over green stretch pants, and she had 3 small red grapes, an avocado, and an oatmeal cookie for lunch. On Thursday afternoon, after lunch, Mrs. Pigeon stood in front of the class with a piece of chalk in her hand. Today, she said, we're going to continue talking about stories. Yay! The second graders said in very loud voices, all but Felicia Ann, who never spoke, and Malcolm, who wasn't paying attention. He was under his desk as usual. Goonie Bird, you weren't here for the first month of school, but our class has been learning about what makes good stories, haven't we, class? Miss Pigeon said. Everyone nodded, all but Malcolm, who was under his desk doing something with scissors. Class, what does a story need most of all? Who remembers? Mrs. Pigeon had her chalk hand in the air, ready to write something on the board. The children were silent for a minute. They were thinking. Finally, Chelsea raised her hand. Chelsea, what does a story need? A book, Chelsea said. Mrs. Pigeon put her chalk hand down. There are many stories that don't need a book, she said pleasantly, aren't there, class? If your grandma tells you a story about when she was a little girl, she doesn't have that story in a book, does she? The class stared at her, all but Malcolm, who was still under his desk, and Felicia Ann, who always looked at the floor, never raised her hand, and never spoke. Beanie said, my grandma lives in Boston. Kaiko said, my grandma lives in Honolulu. Ben said loudly, my grandma lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Tricia shouted, my grandma's very rich. Class, said Mrs. Pigeon. Shh! And then in a quieter voice she explained, another time we will talk about our families, but right now. She stopped talking and looked at Barry Tuckerman. Barry was up on his knees in his seat, and his hand was waving in the air as hard as he could make it wave. Barry, Mrs. Pigeon said, do you have something that you simply have to say? Something that cannot possibly wait? Barry nodded yes, and his hand waved. And what is so important? Barry stood up beside his desk. Barry Tuckerman liked to make very important speeches, and they always required that he stand. My grandma, Barry Tuckerman said, went to jail once. She was 20 years old, and she went to jail for civil disobedience. Then Barry sat down. Thank you, Barry. Now look at what I'm writing on the board. Who can read this word? Everyone, all but Malcolm and Felicia Ann, watched as she began to write the long word. And then they shouted it out. Beginning! So now we learned that the first part of a good story is the beginning. Do you remember the other parts of the story? There's 2 more parts. Good, said Mrs. Pigeon. Now I'm sure you'll all know this one. She wrote it again. Middle, the children shouted. Good, and can you guess what the last word will be? She held up her chalk and waited. End! Correct, Mrs. Pigeon said. Good for you, second graders. Those are the parts that a story needs. A beginning, a middle, and an end. Now I'm going to write another very long word on the board, and let's see what good readers you are. She wrote a C, and then an H. Mrs. Pigeon, someone called. She wrote an A, and then an R. Mrs. Pigeon! Several children were calling now. She turned to see what was so important. Malcolm was standing beside his desk, and he was crying. Malcolm needs to go to the nurse, Mrs. Pigeon, Beanie said. Here's a picture of Malcolm. Mrs. Pigeon went to Malcolm and knelt beside him. What's the trouble, Malcolm? She asked, but he wouldn't stop crying. I know, Nicholas said. Nicholas always knew everything, and his desk was beside Malcolm's. Tell me, Nicholas. Remember Kaiko showed us how to make origami stars? All of the second graders reached into their desks and their pockets and their lunch boxes. There were tiny stars everywhere. Kaiko had showed them how to make origami stars out of small strips of paper. The stars were very easy to make. The school janitor had complained just last Friday that he was sweeping up hundreds of origami stars. Malcolm put one in his nose, Nicholas said, and now he can't get it out. Is that correct, Malcolm? Mrs. Pigeon asked. Malcolm nodded and wiped his eyes. Don't sniff, Malcolm. Do not sniff. That is an order. She took his hand and walked him to the classroom door. She turned to the class. Children, she said, I'm going to be gone for exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds while I walk with Malcolm to the nurse's office down the hall. Stay in your seats while I'm gone and think about the word character. Now, do you remember what I said character was before we started reading? Tell someone or write it down in your notebook now. A character is what a story needs. When I come back from the nurse's office, we're going to create a story together. You must choose who the main character will be. Talk among yourselves quietly. Think about interesting characters like Abraham Lincoln, or perhaps Christopher Columbus, or Babe Ruth, called Ben. Yes, Babe Ruth is a possibility. I'll be right back. Mrs. Pigeon left the classroom with Malcolm, and when she returned 1 minute and 30 seconds later without Malcolm, the class was waiting. They had been whispering, all but Felicia Ann, who never whispered. Have you chosen? She asked. The class nodded. All of their heads went up and down except Felicia Ann's because she always looked at the floor. And your choice is? Now I want to stop and make a prediction. A prediction is a guess that you make while you're reading. Good readers always stop and make predictions as they read, and then they check and see if their predictions are right or wrong. So I want you to make a prediction now. You can tell someone or write it down in your notebook. Who do you think the class will choose as the character for their story? And your choice is? All of the children, all but Felicia Ann, called out together. Goonie Bird Green, they called. Was your prediction right or wrong? It's okay if it was wrong. Good readers still make predictions as they read. Mrs. Pigeon sighed. Class, she said, there are many different kinds of stories. There are stories about imaginary creatures like Dumbo, Tricia called out. Raise your hand if you want to speak, please, Mrs. Pigeon said. But yes, Tricia, you are correct. Dumbo is an imaginary character. There are also stories about real people from history, like Christopher Columbus and... She stopped. Barry Tuckerman was waving and waving his hand. Yes, Barry, do you have something very important to say? Barry Tuckerman stood up. He twisted the bottom of his shirt around and around in his fingers. I forget, he said at last. Well, sit back down then, Barry. Now, I thought, class, that since Christopher Columbus's birthday is coming up soon... She looked at Barry Tuckerman, whose hand was waving like a windmill once again. Barry, she said. Barry Tuckerman stood up again. We already know all the stories about Christopher Columbus, he said. We want to hear a true story about Goonie Bird Green. Yes, Goonie Bird Green, the class called out. Mrs. Pigeon sighed again. I'm afraid I don't know many facts about Goonie Bird Green, she said. I know a lot of facts about Christopher Columbus, though. Christopher Columbus was born in... Now, I want to stop and talk about what an imaginary story is. An imaginary story is a make-believe story. Imaginary characters are characters that you would not see in real life. Tell someone or write down the name of an imaginary story that you know. Tricia from the class called out Dumbo. That's an imaginary story because you wouldn't see Dumbo in real life. Now, Mrs. Pigeon talked about facts. She said she didn't know many facts about Goonie Bird Green, but she did know facts about Christopher Columbus. A fact is something that's true. It can be proven. A fact about me is that I have green eyes. You can look at my eyes and see what color they are. I have 2 arms. That's a fact. Now, if I told you that blue is the best color, that's not a fact. I can't prove that blue is the best color. Some people might like green best, and some might like yellow best. That's called an opinion. So there's facts and there's opinions. Now let's continue. We want Goonie Bird, the class chanted. We want Goonie Bird. Goonie Bird, Miss Pigeon said finally, how do you feel about this? Goonie Bird Green stood up beside her desk in the middle of the room. Can I tell the story? She asked. Can I be right smack in the middle of everything? Can I be the hero? Well, since you would be the main character, Mrs. Pigeon said, I guess that would put you in the middle of everything. I guess that would make you the hero. Good, Goonie Bird said. I will tell you an absolutely true story about me. Now that's the end of chapter 1. I wanted to talk a little bit about the setting of the story. The setting is where or when the story takes place. In the beginning of the chapter, it said that Goonie Bird arrived at Water Tower Elementary School. She arrived in October after the first month of school had already passed. She opened the second grade classroom door at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. Now that one little part on the first page of the chapter told us so much about the setting. It told us that it was October and it was Wednesday. It told us it was 10 o'clock, it was in the morning. It told us it was at Water Tower Elementary School in the second grade classroom. In a chapter book, the setting often changes many times. We're going to talk more about the setting next time. I hope you enjoyed chapter 1, and I'll see you right back here next time for chapter 2.